Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of silent courage and unexpected love that leads to healing. Enjoy the story. Margaret Wilson had been mopping floors at Mercy General Hospital's maternity ward for a decade, her silence as constant as the antiseptic smell that permeated the corridors. At 43, her weathered hands told a story of hard work, but her eyes held secrets that no one had ever bothered to uncover. "Margaret," called Nancy, the head nurse, her voice echoing down the freshly cleaned hallway. "I need your help with something." Margaret looked up, her eyebrows raised in a silent question. Nancy sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. "We've got a situation. A homeless woman just came in, she's in labor, and none of the young nurses want to go near her. The smell—" She wrinkled her nose. "Well, you can imagine. I hate to ask, but could you help me get her cleaned up?" Margaret nodded, setting aside her mop and following Nancy down the hall. As they walked, Nancy continued to chatter nervously. "I swear these new nurses? Back in my day, we didn't turn our noses up at patients, no matter what condition they were in. But now, it's all about their precious sensibilities. I'll be having words with them later, mark my words." They entered a small examination room, where a disheveled young woman was curled up on the bed, her dirty clothes and matted hair a stark contrast to the sterile surroundings. The smell hit Margaret like a wall, but she didn't flinch. "All right, honey," Nancy said gently to the woman. "We're going to get you cleaned up, okay? This is Margaret. She's going to help me." The woman looked up, her eyes wild with pain and fear. "Please," she whimpered, "help my baby. He didn't ask for this. He didn't ask for a fuck-up like me as a mother." Margaret's heart clenched at the raw desperation in the young woman's voice. She approached slowly, holding out her hand in a gesture of peace. "It's okay, sweetie," Nancy soothed. "We're going to take good care of both of you. Now, can you tell me your name?" "Sarah," the woman gasped between contractions. "My name is Sarah." As Margaret helped Sarah into the shower, she couldn't help but notice how young the girl really was beneath the grime. She couldn't have been more than 18 or 19. Once clean and dressed in a hospital gown, Sarah looked almost like any other expectant mother in the ward. But the haunted look in her eyes told a different story. "The doctors here are good, right?" Sarah asked Margaret as she helped her back to the bed. "They'll make sure my baby is okay?" Margaret nodded reassuringly, wishing not for the first time that she could speak, could offer words of comfort. Instead, she squeezed Sarah's hand gently. As contractions intensified, Margaret stepped back, allowing the medical team to take over. She returned to her cleaning duties, but her mind kept wandering back to the young mother-to-be. Hours passed, and Margaret found herself lingering near the delivery room, straining to hear any news. Finally, Nancy emerged, her face grave. "She didn't make it," Nancy said softly. "Complications, kidney failure, infection. We did everything we could." Margaret felt her heart drop. "And the baby?" she wrote quickly on her ever-present notepad. "He's alive," Nancy replied. "Healthy, surprisingly, but with no family. He'll be headed for the system." As Nancy walked away, Margaret stood rooted to the spot, a storm of emotions swirling inside her. She thought of her own loss, the tragedy that had stolen her voice and her son 10 years ago. And in that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. That evening, Margaret's husband, Tom, knew something was wrong the moment she walked through the door of their modest home. "Maggie?" he asked, concern etching his features. "What's happened?" Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her notepad, scribbling furiously. Tom read her words, his eyes widening with each sentence. "You want to adopt a baby?" he asked incredulously. "Maggie, we're in our 40s, and with your condition—" He trailed off, not wanting to hurt her feelings. Margaret's eyes flashed with determination as she wrote again. "I know it sounds crazy, but this baby needs us, and maybe we need him too." Tom sank into a chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not that simple, honey. There are background checks, home studies, and how would you communicate with a child?" Margaret's pen flew across the page. "I'll get the surgery, the one to restore my voice. I've been afraid, but now I have a reason to be brave." Tom's eyes filled with tears as he read her words. He remembered the vibrant, talkative woman she'd been before the accident that had taken their son and robbed her of speech. He'd watched her retreat into silence, refusing the risky surgery that might have restored her voice. "Are you sure about this, Maggie?" he asked softly. "It's a big step." Margaret nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and hope. Tom stood, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Then let's do it," he whispered. "Let's bring that baby home." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret and Tom found themselves navigating a complex maze of paperwork, interviews, and legal hurdles. The social workers were skeptical at first, concerned about Margaret's inability to speak and their age. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, the stern-faced social worker, Miss Jenkins, said during one home visit, "I hope you understand the challenges you'll be facing. Raising a newborn at your age with your unique situation, it won't be easy." Tom squeezed Margaret's hand reassuringly. "We know it won't be easy," he replied, "but we're committed to giving this child a loving home, and Margaret is planning to undergo surgery to regain her speech." Miss Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "That's a major procedure, Mrs. Wilson. Are you certain you're ready for that?" Margaret nodded firmly, writing on her pad. "I've been silent for too long. This child deserves to hear his mother's voice." As the process dragged on, Margaret threw herself into preparations. She transformed their spare room into a nursery, filling it with soft blues and greens. Tom often found her sitting in the rocking chair, a wistful smile on her face as she imagined holding their new son. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they received the call they'd been waiting for. The adoption had been approved. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson," Miss Jenkins said, a rare smile gracing her features. "You can pick up your son tomorrow." That night, neither Margaret nor Tom could sleep. They lay awake, hands clasped, hearts racing with excitement and nerves. "We're really doing this," Tom whispered in the darkness. "We're going to be parents again." Margaret squeezed his hand in response, her silent tears of joy soaking the pillow. The day they brought baby Samuel home was one of joy tinged with bittersweet emotions. As Margaret cradled the tiny bundle in her arms, she couldn't help but think of Sarah, the young woman who had given him life at the cost of her own. "He's perfect," Tom breathed, gently stroking Samuel's cheek. "Look at those tiny fingers." Margaret nodded, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She reached for her notepad, scribbling quickly. "I wish I could tell him how much we love him already." Tom read her words and smiled. "You will, honey. Soon. Your surgery is scheduled for next month, remember?" As the days passed, Margaret and Tom fell into the exhausting but rewarding routine of new parenthood. Midnight feedings, diaper changes, and endless lullabies filled their once quiet home with new life. Margaret's co-workers at the hospital were a mixed bag of reactions. Some, like Nancy, were supportive and thrilled for her. Others whispered behind her back, questioning her ability to raise a child. "I just don't understand it," Margaret overheard one young nurse say in the break room. "How is she going to take care of a baby when she can't even speak?" Nancy, overhearing, was quick to jump to Margaret's defense. "That woman has more love in her silent heart than most people have in their entire bodies," she snapped. "That baby is lucky to have her." As the date of her surgery approached, Margaret's anxiety grew. The procedure was risky, with no guarantee of success. But every time she looked at Samuel's cherubic face, she knew it was worth the risk. The night before the surgery, Margaret sat in the nursery, rocking Samuel gently. Tom found her there, tears streaming down her face. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside them. "What's wrong?" Margaret reached for her notepad with her free hand. "What if it doesn't work? What if I can never speak to our son?" Tom took her hand, kissing it gently. "Then we'll love him just the same," he assured her. "Your voice isn't what makes you a mother, Maggie. It's your heart." The surgery was long and nerve-wracking. Tom paced the waiting room, alternating between worried prayers and hopeful daydreams of hearing his wife's voice again. Finally, the doctor emerged, looking tired but pleased. "The surgery was a success," he announced. "Now we wait for the healing process. It will take time and therapy, but I'm optimistic about Mrs. Wilson regaining her speech." The recovery period was frustrating for Margaret. She ached to call out to Samuel, to sing him lullabies, to whisper, "I love you," as she rocked him to sleep. But she followed the doctor's orders diligently, working with a speech therapist to slowly regain control of her long-dormant vocal cords. Weeks turned into months. Samuel grew bigger, his personality blossoming. He was a happy baby, always quick with a smile or a gurgle. Margaret communicated with him through touch, through the love in her eyes, and through the silent songs she would mouth as she cradled him. Then, one ordinary Wednesday afternoon, it happened. Margaret was changing Samuel's diaper, cooing at him silently as she always did. Samuel looked up at her with his big blue eyes and smiled. "Mama," he babbled, reaching for her face. Margaret's heart stopped. Without thinking, she opened her mouth and whispered, "Yes, baby, Mama's here." The sound was rough, barely above a whisper, but it was there. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she scooped Samuel up, holding him close. "Tom!" she called, her voice cracking with emotion and disuse. "Tom, come quick!" Tom came running, skidding to a stop in the nursery doorway. "Maggie?" he gasped. "Did you just—" Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I can talk," she whispered. "Oh, Tom, I can talk." That night, as they put Samuel to bed, Margaret sang a lullaby for the first time. Her voice was soft and a bit unsteady, but to Tom and Samuel, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Life settled into a new normal for the Wilsons. Margaret continued her speech therapy, growing stronger and more confident in her voice every day. She returned to work at the hospital, this time as a patient care assistant, determined to help other mothers the way she wished someone had helped Sarah. Samuel was thriving, growing into a curious and affectionate toddler. Margaret and Tom delighted in every milestone, every new word, every sloppy kiss. Then, on Samuel's second birthday, an unexpected visitor arrived. Margaret was in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on Samuel's birthday cake when the doorbell rang. Tom answered it, and she heard murmured conversation from the entryway. "Maggie?" Tom called, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Can you come here, please?" Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and headed to the front door. There, she found Tom standing with an older gentleman, distinguished-looking with silver hair and sad eyes. "Mrs. Wilson," the man said, extending his hand. "My name is Michael Stewart. I'm Sarah's stepfather." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "Sarah?" she whispered. "Samuel's birth mother?" Michael nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "May I come in? I have quite a story to tell you." Over coffee in the living room, with Samuel napping upstairs, Michael poured out his heart. He told them of his late wife, of his troubled relationship with his stepdaughter Sarah, of the fight that had driven her to the streets. "I was so angry," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I told her never to come back, and then it was too late. By the time I came to my senses, started looking for her, all I found was a death certificate and a birth record." Margaret reached out, squeezing Michael's hand. "She was so young," she said softly, "but she loved Samuel. Her last words were about making sure he was okay." Michael nodded, wiping his eyes. "I failed her," he said. "I can't fail her son too. I'm not here to take him away. Please understand that. I want to help, to make sure he has every opportunity Sarah didn't." He pulled out a checkbook, his hand shaking slightly. "I've made a trust fund for Samuel," he explained, "for his education, for anything he might need. I know it doesn't make up for what happened, but—" Tom and Margaret exchanged a look. "Mr. Stewart," Tom began carefully, "we appreciate the gesture, but Samuel is our son. We don't need—" "Please," Michael interrupted. "I'm not trying to buy my way into his life. I just want to know he'll be taken care of, that he'll have chances Sarah never did." Margaret studied the older man's face, seeing the pain and regret etched in every line. She thought of Sarah, of the desperation in her eyes that day in the hospital. "How would you like to stay for birthday cake?" she asked softly. "Samuel would love to meet his grandfather." Michael's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. I would be honored," he whispered. As they sang Happy Birthday to a delighted Samuel, Margaret looked around at her unlikely family. Her husband, their adopted son, and now this man connected to them by tragedy and hope. She thought of the long, silent years after losing her first child, of the fear that had kept her voice locked away. Now, as she watched Samuel smear frosting on Michael's nose, eliciting genuine laughter from the older man, she sent up a silent thank you to Sarah for her sacrifice, to the doctors who had given her back her voice, and to Samuel, the little boy who had brought healing and joy back into their lives. "I love you," she whispered to her son, reveling in the ability to say the words out loud. "More than you'll ever know."